February 12, 1912. The Forbidden City. The smell of burning incense mingled with the cold, dry air of a dying winter. An empire of 268 years vanished with the stroke of a brush. Empress Dowager Longyu sat in the hall of mental cultivation, her face a mask of exhaustion. Beside her, the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi played with a toy, oblivious to the fact that his world had just collapsed. The decree of abdication lay on the table, still wet with the ink of the Great Seal. This was the end of the Great Qing. Outside the Vermilion Walls, the Republic of China was being born in fire and chaos. Yet inside these walls, a strange and fragile deal had been struck to keep the past alive. It was called the Articles of Favorable Treatment. This legal document was a bridge between two worlds, a compromise between a crumbling monarchy and a desperate new republic. It promised that the emperor would keep his title, his servants, and his home. For the women of the court, this document was their only lifeline. The Dowager Empress and the numerous concubines of the previous emperors were not cast out into the streets. Instead, they were granted the right to remain in the inner sanctum of the palace. The Republic agreed to pay the imperial family 4 million taels of silver every year. This massive sum was intended to maintain the lavish lifestyle of the court and the thousands of people who served them. It was a king's ransom paid by a nation that had no king. To the outside world, the Republic was a modern, democratic experiment. To those inside, the Republic was merely a distant benefactor paying for a ghost to keep haunting its house. The walls of the Forbidden City became the borders of a tiny, sovereign island of the past. The concubines, many of whom had not seen the outside world in decades, watched the transition with silent terror. They were women whose entire existence was defined by their relationship to a throne that no longer ruled. Without the palace, they were nothing. Within the palace, they were relics. Long Yu, the woman who signed away the empire, now found herself the leader of a gilded cage. She was responsible for hundreds of ladies-in-waiting, eunuchs, and the aging consorts of emperors long dead. The Articles of Favorable Treatment were her only shield against the rising tide of modernity. The documents specified that the imperial family would eventually move to the Summer Palace. However, that eventually was never defined, allowing the court to linger in the heart of Beijing. Year after year, the gates remained shut to the public, preserving a medieval reality. Life continued as if the revolution had never happened. Eunuchs still bowed low, silk robes still rustled in the corridors, and the complex rituals of the court were performed with desperate precision. It was a masquerade of power sustained by a piece of paper. The Republican government, led by Yuan Shikai, needed this arrangement to ensure a peaceful transition. By keeping the imperial family housed and fed, they prevented a royalist uprising. They bought stability with silver, hoping the old world would simply wither away on its own. But the cost of maintaining this phantom court was astronomical. 4 million silver dollars was a burden the young, debt-ridden republic could ill afford. As the political climate shifted and warlords began to tear the country apart, the checks stopped arriving. The concubines were trapped in a paradox of luxury and decay. They lived in palaces of unimaginable wealth, surrounded by priceless treasures, yet they were becoming prisoners of their own status. The Articles of Favorable Treatment were slowly turning from a sanctuary into a death warrant. They did not know that the world outside was moving faster than they could imagine. While they debated the placement of incense burners, the men who signed their contract were being replaced by those who had no respect for tradition. The ink on the treaty was fading, and the silver was running dry. For 12 years, this legal fiction held the walls together. 12 years of pretending the sun had not set on the Son of Heaven. But the silence of the Forbidden City was about to be shattered by the sound of boots on stone. The promises of the Republic were written in sand, and the tide was finally coming in. The women of the Qing were about to discover that a contract is only as strong as the men who hold the bayonets. Chapter 2. 12 years of limbo inside the Forbidden City. The heavy doors of the Meridian Gate swung shut, and for 12 years they stayed that way. Inside, the air grew thick with the scent of sandalwood and the heavy weight of a dead era. Time did not flow here. It pooled like stagnant water in the palace moats. The women of the court woke every morning to the same ancient rhythms. Eunuchs still knelt to offer basins of warm water, and seamstresses still labored over robes that would never be seen by a public eye. Every kowtow was a performance intended to convince themselves that the world had not changed. These women lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between a glorious past and an uncertain future. They were the high consorts of the Guangxu and Tongxi emperors, women who had once held the power of life and death. Now they held only the empty titles of a defunct dynasty, presiding over a court of shadows. Outside the walls, Beijing was transforming into a city of telegraph wires, motorcars, and student protests. Inside, the only sound was the rustle of silk and the rhythmic chanting of Buddhist sutras. The contrast was so sharp it felt like two different centuries existing on the same patch of earth. To the Republic, this was the small court, a diplomatic curiosity that existed by the grace of a contract. To the concubines, it was the only reality they had ever known since they were teenagers. They walked the same stone paths, watched the same goldfish, and waited for a restoration that was never coming. The young Puyi was the sun around which these aging planets orbited. The dowager consorts, particularly Duankang and Jingyi, fought bitter internal battles over his education and his daily schedule. These petty power struggles were all they had left to occupy their brilliant, trapped minds. Every meal was still an elaborate affair of 30 dishes, even if the quality of the ingredients began to slip. Every festival was celebrated with the prescribed firecrackers and incense, though the crowds grew thinner each year. They were curators of their own mausoleum, polishing the brass while the foundation cracked. This limbo was not merely physical. It was a profound psychological erosion. The lower-ranking concubines and ladies-in-waiting began to realize that their youth was being sacrificed to a ghost. They watched the grey bricks of the Forbidden City with a mixture of reverence and quiet, suffocating resentment. Communication with the outside world was strictly filtered through the eunuchs, who were themselves becoming increasingly desperate. Many of these servants began to smuggle out small treasures like jade hairpins or silver cups to sell in the city markets. The very walls that protected the women were being slowly hollowed out from the inside. The Dowager Empress Longyu passed away only a year after the abdication, leaving a vacuum of leadership. The remaining consorts stepped into the gap, turning the inner courts into a labyrinth of etiquette and paranoia. They were determined to maintain the dignity of the Qing, even if they had to starve to do it. As the years stretched into a decade, the Republic's promised silver began to arrive late, then in smaller amounts, then not at all. The lavish banquets were replaced by simpler fare, and the heating in the drafty halls was cut back during the brutal winters. The gilded cage was becoming a cold, dark cell. Yet, the women refused to acknowledge the encroaching poverty. They wore their finest jewelry to tea ceremonies, where the tea was of the lowest grade. They spoke in the refined dialect of the Manchu elite, ignoring the shouts of revolutionary soldiers that sometimes echoed over the walls. For 12 years, the Forbidden City was a theatre where the play never ended, even after the audience had gone home. The actors were tired, the costumes were fraying, and the stage lights were flickering out. They were waiting for a finale they could not possibly imagine. The year 1924 arrived with a chill that felt different from the others. A new power was rising in the north, a man who viewed the small court not as a guest, but as a parasite. The fragile legal fiction of the Articles of Favorable Treatment was about to be torn to shreds. The gates that had stayed shut for 12 years were about to be kicked open by a warlord who did not care about contracts. The dream was over, and the nightmare was standing at the threshold. Chapter 3. The crumbling luxury of a forgotten court. The Forbidden City was a masterpiece of architecture, But without an empire to sustain it, the palace began to rot from the inside out. The brilliant red paint on the massive columns started to flake away like dried blood under the harsh Beijing sun. Dust, thick and grey, settled over the gold-leafed thrones and the intricate jade carvings that no one dared to move. In the private quarters of the concubines, the luxury was becoming a ghost of itself. They sat on chairs made of precious Zaitan wood, surrounded by treasures that could have bought entire cities, yet they were often shivering. The coal for the brazier heaters was strictly rationed, leaving the grand halls smelling of damp stone and unwashed silk. The high consorts, women who had once been the peak of refinement, now lived in a world of beautiful ruins. They wore embroidered robes that were decades old, their threads fraying at the edges where they touched the dusty floors. Every morning they painted their faces with lead-based powders, masking the wrinkles of age and the growing anxiety of their precarious position. The gardens of the inner court, once perfectly manicured, became a wilderness of tall grass and forgotten paths. Weeds pushed through the white marble tiles, cracking the foundations of the pavilions, where emperors had once written poetry. The goldfish in the ornamental ponds grew sluggish, fed on meager scraps instead of the premium pellets of the imperial past. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the silence was absolute and terrifying. The thousands of eunuchs who once swarmed these courtyards had dwindled to a few hundred desperate souls. Those who remained were often elderly or too broken to leave, their loyalty born more from a lack of options than true devotion to the throne. These servants became the architects of a grand, desperate deception. They would polish the brass handles of the doors even as the wood behind the metal began to splinter and warp. They maintained the illusion of a functioning court for the sake of the women who could not imagine a life beyond these walls. Money was the invisible poison slowly killing the palace. The 4 million taels promised by the Republic were often intercepted by corrupt officials or lost in the chaos of the warring factions outside. The court was forced to start selling off its soul, piece by piece, just to keep the kitchens running. Priceless scrolls from the Qing Dynasty and porcelain vases from the Ming era began to disappear from the hidden storerooms. Eunuchs would smuggle them out under their heavy robes, selling them to antique dealers in the legation quarter for a fraction of their value. The imperial collection, the greatest assembly of art in human history, was being bled dry to buy bags of rice. High Consort Jingyi, a woman of iron will and sharp intellect, watched this slow dissolution with a bitter heart. She knew that every sold artifact was a brick removed from the wall that kept the modern world at bay. She insisted on the strictest adherence to protocol, punishing any servant who showed even a hint of the chaos reigning outside. For the younger concubines and ladies-in-waiting, the crumbling luxury was a psychological prison. They were surrounded by symbols of absolute power that held no actual weight in the real world anymore. They lived in a museum of their own lives, waiting for a future that looked increasingly like a terrifying void. The smell of the palace changed during these long, stagnant years. The sweet fragrance of expensive incense was replaced by the stale odor of trapped air and the faint, metallic scent of mold. It was the smell of a body that was still breathing, but had long since died. Even the food, once a legendary display of culinary excess, became a source of quiet shame. The 30 dishes served at each meal were often recycled or made with inferior grains disguised by heavy, salty sauces. The women ate in a heavy silence, the clink of their silver chopsticks against porcelain the only sound in the cavernous dining halls. Outside the walls, the Republic was descending into the brutal era of the warlords. Men with private armies and no respect for the articles of favorable treatment were carving up the country like a feast. To these new masters of China, the Forbidden City was not a sacred site, but a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open. The ladies of the court remained oblivious to the specific names of the generals rising to power. They only knew that the checks from the government were coming less often, and the soldiers at the gates looked grimmer each day. The world was forgetting them, and in the silence of the palace, they were slowly forgetting the world. They spent their days in a cycle of prayer and petty gossip, clinging to the hierarchy that gave their lives meaning. A consort of the fourth rank still demanded the proper kowtow from a servant, even if that servant was the one who had to sneak out and pawn her jewelry. It was a desperate, beautiful, and pathetic dance performed on the edge of a cliff. The luxury was no longer a comfort, it was a burden, a heavy weight of history that they were forced to carry alone. Each day the sun rose over the yellow-tiled roofs. It illuminated more cracks, more dust, and more despair. The grand experiment of the small court was failing, and the walls were no longer thick enough to keep out the cold. By the early 1920s, the Forbidden City had become a tomb for the living. The women inside were the last remnants of a 3,000-year-old tradition, standing on a stage where the curtains were already falling. They were waiting for a savior, but the only thing approaching was the sound of thunder from the north. The Republic was no longer a benefactor. It was a bankrupt entity looking for someone to blame for its many failures. The 4 million silver dollars was a debt they no longer had any intention of paying. In the shadows of the northern barracks, a general named Feng Yuxiang was looking at the palace with eyes full of fire. The legal contract that protected them was now nothing more than a scrap of paper in a windstorm. The wolves were no longer at the door. They were already testing the locks. Chapter 4. When the Republic stopped paying the bills. The 4 million silver dollars promised by the Republic had become a ghost in the ledger books by the early 1920s. The new government was a revolving door of generals and bureaucrats, none of whom felt bound by a contract signed a decade earlier. To the men in power, the Forbidden City was no longer a symbol of national transition, but a massive, unpaid debt. The treasury of the small court was effectively empty, yet the expenses remained imperial. There were still hundreds of eunuchs to feed, rituals to fund, and the delicate palates of the high consorts to satisfy. The women who had never touched money in their lives were suddenly forced to understand the brutal mathematics of survival. High Consort Jingyi and High Consort Rongui watched as the daily shipments of coal and rice grew smaller and of poorer quality. They were the widows of emperors, women whose status was once measured in provinces and gold. Now they were haggling through intermediaries over the price of lamp oil and winter charcoal. The Republic's failure to pay was not merely a matter of bankruptcy, it was a deliberate political strangulation. Each missed payment was a message from the outside world that the old order was being erased. The soldiers guarding the gates, once respectful of the dragon throne, now openly mocked the servants who passed through. Inside the inner chambers, the atmosphere shifted from quiet dignity to a frantic, whispered desperation. The concubines began to realize that their silk robes and jade hairpins were the only currency they had left. One by one, the personal treasures of the women began to disappear into the pockets of eunuchs who promised to sell them for food. A single pearl necklace, once a gift from an emperor, might buy enough grain to feed a courtyard for a month. The women would watch from behind their screens as their legacy was carried away in small wooden boxes. They were eating their own history, consuming the very symbols of their rank just to stay alive. The eunuchs, sensing the end was near, became bolder in their thefts. They knew the women could not report them to the Republican police without exposing the court's total loss of control. Entire storerooms of ancient silk and porcelain were emptied overnight, leaving the grand halls hollow and echoing. In 1923, a massive fire broke out in the Palace of Established Happiness, lighting up the Beijing sky for miles. It was widely believed that the eunuchs started the blaze to cover up their systematic looting of the imperial collection. The high consorts watched the flames from their balconies, the orange light reflecting in eyes that had seen too much loss. The fire consumed thousands of priceless artifacts, but it also burned away the last remnants of the court's financial stability. The Republic used the chaos as an excuse to further slash the budget, claiming the imperial family could not even manage their own safety. The walls of the Forbidden City were no longer protecting the women. They were containing a slow-motion disaster. Public opinion outside the walls was also turning sharply against the inhabitants of the palace. In the tea houses of Beijing, citizens grumbled about the millions of dollars still officially owed to a family that did nothing for the nation. The concubines were portrayed in the new newspapers as parasites living in a gilded tomb at the taxpayers' expense. To the young students and revolutionaries, the articles of favorable treatment were a national humiliation. They saw the continued existence of the small court as a stain on the republic's sovereignty. The political pressure to tear up the contract and evict the imperial family was reaching a breaking point. The high consorts tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, holding tea ceremonies in rooms where the wallpaper was peeling from the damp. They spoke of the past because the present was too painful, and the future was a dark void. Their world had become a thin layer of gold leaf stretched over a rotting wooden frame. By 1924, the checks from the government stopped entirely, leaving the palace in total financial paralysis. The kitchens were often cold, and the ladies of the court began to suffer from the same malnutrition as the peasants they once ruled. The transition from empresses to paupers was almost complete, hidden only by the height of the vermilion walls. The women spent their nights in prayer, hoping for a restoration or a miracle that would never come. They did not know that a man named Feng Yuxiang, known as the Christian general, was marching toward Beijing with a very different vision for the palace. He did not believe in favorable treatment, and he did not believe in ghosts. The legal shield that had protected these women for 12 years was about to be shattered by the butt of a rifle. The Republic was done paying for the past, and it was time for the debt to be collected in person. The gates of the Forbidden City were no longer a barrier, they were a target. The final act of the Qing Dynasty was about to begin, dictated not by legal treaties, but by military force. Chapter 5. The hierarchy of the remaining imperial women. The social ladder of the Forbidden City did not collapse with the revolution, it merely became more brittle. Inside the vermilion walls, the ancient ranks of the Qing court were preserved like insects trapped in amber. While the Republic outside spoke of equality and citizens, the women of the small court lived by a code of precedence that dated back centuries. At the pinnacle of this decaying pyramid were the dowager consorts, the widows of the emperors who preceded Puyi. High Consort Jingyi and High Consort Rongwei were the two most powerful women left in the palace. They did not see themselves as relics, but as the guardians of a sacred flame that had burned for 300 years. The Tongji consorts were locked in a silent, bitter struggle for influence over the young emperor against the Guangxu consort, Duankang. Because Puyi had been adopted as the heir to both lineages, both sides claimed a maternal right to his life. They fought over the smallest details, from the curriculum of his tutors to the specific silk used in his winter robes. To the outside world, these were petty squabbles of a forgotten age, but inside they were battles for the soul of the dynasty. Jingyi was known for her sharp tongue and iron will, often using her seniority to humiliate those she deemed beneath her. Ronghui was more subtle, a master of the quiet maneuver who used her remaining influence to maintain a shadow of the imperial dignity. Beneath these titans were the forgotten concubines of the 4th and 5th ranks, women who had entered the palace as teenagers and never left. They lived in the side courtyards, their lives defined by a crushing boredom and a desperate need to maintain appearances. They still demanded the 3 kowtows and the 9 prostrations from their servants, even if their tea was cold and their rooms were dim. These women were the invisible middle class of the palace, caught between the power of the high consorts and the labor of the servants. They spent their days practicing calligraphy or tending to small, hidden gardens, trying to ignore the sound of the modern world outside. Their status was their only protection against the realization that they were effectively prisoners of a dead system. The hierarchy was not just a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival in a world of shrinking resources. The high consorts received the largest share of the remaining food and fuel, while the lower-ranking women were often left to shiver in the winter. Every piece of charcoal and every bowl of rice was distributed according to a rank that no longer had a country to back it up. Even the servants were divided into a complex web of seniority and favor. The head eunuchs still commanded small armies of cleaners and cooks, maintaining a shadow of the imperial bureaucracy. These men were the gatekeepers of information, deciding which news from the Republic would reach the ears of the high-ranking women. The ladies-in-waiting, often young girls from noble Manchu families, occupied a strange space in this hierarchy. They were the companions to the consorts, trained in the highest arts of the court, yet they were essentially high-status servants. They watched their own youth slip away in the service of women who were obsessed with a past that would never return. Communication between the different levels of this hierarchy was strictly regulated by a centuries-old protocol. A lower-ranking concubine could not speak directly to a high consort without an invitation, even if they were the only two people in the room. This formality provided a sense of order that kept the growing chaos at the gates from seeping into their minds. As the financial situation worsened, the hierarchy became a weapon used to settle old scores. A high consort might withhold a ration of silk or a specific delicacy to punish a rival or a disobedient subordinate. In the vacuum of real political power, these small cruelties became the only way to assert one's existence. The young Puyi moved through this world like a living idol, worshipped by everyone but understood by no one. He was the center of the hierarchy, the sun that gave light to all these fading stars, yet he was also a victim of their expectations. The women around him were not just his family. They were the architects of the mental cage he inhabited. By 1924, the hierarchy was stretched to its breaking point as the external world prepared to intervene. The rigid structures that had held the small court together were about to face a force that did not recognize rank or title. The women of the Forbidden City were still arguing over tea service while the foundations of their world were being mined with explosives. The social order they had spent 12 years preserving was nothing more than a house of cards in a rising gale. The internal battles for status and influence were about to become irrelevant in the face of a raw military reality. The women who had spent decades mastering the art of the kowtow were about to be told that their knees were no longer required. The hierarchy was a beautiful, terrible lie that they all agreed to believe until the very end. But the end was no longer a distant threat. It was an army in grey uniforms standing at the Meridian Gate. General Feng Yushang's forces were tired of waiting for the debt to be paid, and his subordinate was coming to collect it with a ticking clock and drawn bayonets. The clock was ticking, and the women inside had exactly 3 hours to erase 12 years of history. The gates were about to open, and for the first time in their lives, the hierarchy would not save them. Chapter 6. The 1924 Expulsion and the End of the Dream. The morning of November 5, 1924, arrived with a bite in the air that no silk robe could deflect. At approximately 9 o'clock, the heavy silence of the Meridian Gate was shattered by the rhythmic thud of military boots. General Lu Zhonglin, acting under the orders of the warlord Feng Yuxiang, marched into the palace grounds with a detachment of armed soldiers. They did not bow, they did not wait for an audience, and they did not care for the ancient protocols of the Qing. The soldiers carried a revised version of the Articles of Favorable Treatment, which was less a contract and more an eviction notice. It demanded that the imperial family and all their attendants vacate the Forbidden City by 3 o'clock that afternoon. For the women of the inner court, who had lived within these walls for decades, the concept of 3 hours was an absurdity. They had measured their lives in dynasties and seasons, not in the frantic ticking of a modern watch. Inside the palace of mind nurturing, the young Puyi was startled from his morning routine by a frantic eunuch who collapsed at his feet. The news spread through the labyrinthine corridors like a wildfire, leaping from one courtyard to the next. The concubines, who were mid-toilette or finishing their morning tea, suddenly found their sanctuary invaded by the harsh reality of steel and gunpowder. The dream of the small court was dissolving before their very eyes. High Consort Jingyi, the formidable widow of the Tongji Emperor, met the news with a cold, terrifying fury. She stood in her reception hall, a small woman draped in heavy embroidery, and refused to acknowledge the presence of the Republican officers. To her, these men were not representatives of a new era, but bandits trespassing on sacred ground. She demanded to see the legal documents, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer indignity of the moment. The scene quickly descended into a panicked, disjointed scramble for survival. Concubines who had never packed a bag in their lives were suddenly throwing jade ornaments and silk scarves into wooden chests. There was no time to organize, no time to choose what truly mattered from the thousands of treasures they owned. The air was thick with the smell of old dust and the sharp, metallic scent of the soldiers' rifles. Many of the lower-ranking women were found weeping in the corners of their rooms, paralyzed by the thought of the world beyond the walls. For some, the Forbidden City was the only world they had ever known since they were teenagers. They looked at the red walls and the yellow roofs not as a prison, but as the boundaries of the universe. To be cast out was not just an eviction, it was a form of cosmic displacement. The eunuchs, sensing the total collapse of the old order, began to flee with whatever they could hide under their robes. Some tried to protect the women they had served for years, while others simply disappeared into the shadows of the outer courts. The hierarchy that had governed every breath for 12 years was replaced by a raw, desperate scramble for the exit. The soldiers stood in the courtyards, smoking cigarettes and watching the end of an empire with bored indifference. As the deadline approached, the pressure from General Lu Zhonglin became more aggressive. He famously produced a pocket watch and informed the imperial representatives that if the palace was not empty by 3, he would order his artillery to fire. This was the final blow to the illusion of imperial sanctity. The threat of high explosives did what 12 years of political pressure could not. It forced the hand of the gods. The departure was a somber, pathetic procession of carts and a few modern motorcars. Puyi left in a car, flanked by Republican guards, looking like a bewildered child lost in a crowd. Behind him followed the women, their faces pale behind thick layers of white powder, their eyes fixed on the floor of their carriages. They passed through the gates that had once been the threshold of the divine, entering a Beijing that was noisy, crowded, and utterly alien. The crowds gathered outside the Forbidden City to watch the spectacle of the century. People who had only ever heard of the hidden flowers of the palace now saw them as ordinary frightened women huddled in the back of open carts. The mystique of the Qing was being stripped away in the harsh light of a November afternoon. The gold leaf was gone, and only the vulnerable human beings remained. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the Forbidden City was officially empty of its imperial residents. The gates were locked by the Republican guards, and the keys were handed over to the new administration. The 3,000-year-old tradition of the imperial court had ended not with a grand battle, but with a series of signatures and a forced march. The imperial illusion had finally collapsed, and the cold reality of the 20th century had breached the walls. However, while the world believed the palace was cleared, 2 shadows remained deep within the inner court. High Consort Jingyi and High Consort Rongwei had not boarded the carts, and they had not surrendered their dignity. They had barricaded themselves inside their private quarters, and they were not going anywhere without a fight. The Republic thought they had evicted the past, but they had forgotten that some ghosts are too stubborn to leave. 2 elderly women were about to hold an entire army at bay from behind a locked wooden door. Chapter 7. 2 concubines against an army. The 16-day standoff. The Republican soldiers thought their work was finished as the sun set over the yellow tiles of the Forbidden City. They had counted the heads and seen the motorcars depart with the young emperor, Puyi, into the dusty streets of Beijing. But deep within the palace of gathering elegance, the lamps were still burning low, casting long shadows against the silk-covered walls. High Consort Jingyi and High Consort Rongwei had not moved from their carved sandalwood chairs. They were women who had survived the Boxer Rebellion, the 1911 revolution, and a decade of internal isolation. To them, a general with a pocket watch was merely a temporary nuisance in a long history of dynastic chaos. When the guards came to their doors to announce the final evacuation, they were met with a chilling and regal silence. The doors were barred from the inside, a simple wooden bolt standing against the weight of a modern, rifle-armed military force. The two women refused to speak to anyone who did not address them by their full formal imperial titles. General Liu Zhonglin found himself in an unexpected and embarrassing political minefield. While he possessed the military power to break down the doors, the optics of dragging two elderly, high-ranking women into the streets were disastrous. Even in a republic, the ancient Confucian respect for elders remained a powerful and volatile social force. For the first few days, the standoff was a quiet war of nerves that played out in the shadows of the inner court. The soldiers occupied the outer courtyards, their cooking fires staining the pristine white marble with greasy soot. Inside the inner chambers, the two consorts maintained a ghost of their former lives with an iron discipline. They had a small cache of food and a few loyal female attendants who had chosen to stay behind in the darkness. They drank tea made from melted snow and ate dried fruits that had been intended for the winter festivals. Every morning, they dressed in their finest ceremonial robes as if the imperial court was still in session. The Republic tried to starve them out, cutting off the remaining water and fuel supplies to their specific wing of the palace. The November air turned the stone rooms into a refrigerator, the cold seeping through the thick silk hangings and jade floor tiles. Yet, the women did not complain, viewing their physical suffering as a final sacrifice for the great Qing. News of the holdout began to leak to the international press and the crowded tea houses of Beijing. The public, who had just cheered the emperor's departure, now felt a strange twinge of admiration for the two widows. They were called the last defenders of the dragon, two grandmothers standing against a tide of modern bayonets. By the 10th day, the tension inside the Forbidden City was palpable and thick with the scent of old incense. General Liu was under immense pressure from his superiors to finalize the handover of the palace to the government. Every hour the women remained was an hour the Republic did not have full control over the national symbol. Negotiators were sent to the doors, shouting through the heavy wood about the benefits of the new lifestyle awaiting them. They promised a comfortable residence in the city and a continued, albeit significantly reduced, pension for their service. The only response from within was the rhythmic, steady clicking of prayer beads against heavy silk sleeves. Jingyi, the more vocal of the two, eventually spoke through the screen, her voice thin but remarkably steady. She reminded the men outside that they were standing on the graves of their ancestors, masters, and lords. She claimed that if they entered by force, she would ensure her death was a curse upon the new government. This was no longer a military problem. It was a spiritual and cultural crisis for the young and fragile Republic. The soldiers, many of whom were superstitious peasants from the provinces, grew uneasy guarding the ghosts of the empresses. Whispers of imperial curses and bad luck began to circulate among the ranks during the long freezing nights. On the 14th day, the physical toll on the two women became impossible for their attendants to ignore. They were in their 70s, and the lack of heat and fresh food was beginning to claim their fragile health. Their breathing became labored, and the fine embroidery of their sleeves was now covered in the dust of a dying world. A final ultimatum was delivered, not by a soldier, but by a respected elder statesman who had once served the king. He pleaded with them to preserve their lives so that the history of the court would not die with them. He argued that their presence in the city would serve as a living bridge between the old and the new. On the 16th day, the bolt was finally drawn back from the inside of the heavy palace door. The wood creaked open, revealing two figures who looked like porcelain dolls that had been left out in the rain. They did not look at the soldiers as they stepped out into the blinding, harsh light of the courtyard. They were allowed to leave with a small caravan of personal items, a tiny fraction of what they had once owned. As they passed through the gates, Jingyi reportedly turned back and looked at the yellow roofs one last time. She did not weep, for she had no more tears left for a world that had already vanished. Their 16-day defiance was the final heartbeat of the imperial system within the walls of the Forbidden City. Once they were gone, the soldiers moved in to strip the remaining silk from the walls and seal the doors. The transition was complete, and the women were now just citizens in a city that had forgotten how to bow. They were moved to the mansion of Puyi's father, a place of relative comfort but strict seclusion. Yet even from within its walls, they could sense that the world outside was loud, chaotic, and utterly indifferent to their titles or their 16 days of courage. The reality of life as a commoner was a weight they were not prepared to carry into their old age. But for the thousands of lower-ranking concubines and maids who had been cast out before them, there was no mansion. For these women, the end of the empire was not a standoff, but a descent into a living nightmare. Chapter 8. The harsh reality of life beyond the palace walls. The gates of the Forbidden City did not just lead to a street, they led to a different century. For the hundreds of women who had spent their entire adult lives in the silence of the inner court, the air of Beijing was a physical assault. The smell of coal smoke, the roar of early motor cars, and the relentless shouting of street vendors created a cacophony that their ears were not built to process. Most of these women were unmoored, cast out with little more than a small bundle of silk and a few pieces of jewelry tucked into their sleeves. They stood on the dusty pavement, looking back at the red walls that had been their universe, realizing they no longer had a home. The hierarchy that had protected and oppressed them was gone, replaced by a world that valued currency over lineage. For a palace maid of the lower ranks, the immediate problem was survival in a city that had no place for her. Many had been taken from their families as young teenagers and had long since lost contact with their ancestral villages. They were orphans of a dead empire, possessing skills that were now entirely useless in a modernizing republic. They knew how to prepare a tea ceremony with 36 steps, but they did not know how to buy a loaf of bread. They could recite Qing Dynasty poetry from memory, but they had never handled paper money or negotiated with a landlord. The delicate hands that had once practiced calligraphy were now trembling as they clutched the few coins they had left. Some women found temporary shelter in the crowded tenements of the legation quarter, or the narrow hutongs surrounding the palace. They lived in cramped, damp rooms that smelled of mold and poverty, a far cry from the incense-scented halls of the Palace of Eternal Spring. Every piece of jade or gold hairpin they had managed to smuggle out was slowly traded away for basic necessities. The pawnshops of Beijing became the final resting places for the treasures of the Qing. A merchant would offer a pittance for a hairpin that had once been worn in the presence of the Empress Dowager Cixi. The women had no choice but to accept, watching their history being weighed on a scale and sold to the highest bidder. Socially, they were pariahs, viewed with a mixture of curiosity and contempt by the citizens of the new China. To the revolutionaries, they were symbols of a decadent and corrupt past that needed to be erased. To the commoners, they were ghosts who brought bad luck, women who had outlived their purpose and their masters. Even their physical appearance marked them as relics of a vanished age. Their elaborate hairstyles and traditional Manchu robes, once the height of imperial fashion, were now seen as costumes of a theater that had closed its doors. Walking down the street, they were stared at as if they were museum exhibits that had accidentally wandered into the sunlight. Marriage, the traditional escape for women of that era, was often a path fraught with further exploitation. Some were taken in as secondary wives by wealthy merchants or local warlords who wanted the prestige of owning an imperial flower. In these households, they were often treated as curiosities rather than wives, subjected to the jealousy of the first wives and the boredom of a new kind of confinement. Others were less fortunate, finding that their only value in the city was their bodies. The transition from the sacred halls of the Forbidden City to the brothels of the 8 great hutongs was a descent into a darkness that no poem could describe. The tragedy was not just the loss of status, but the total erasure of their human dignity in the name of survival. There were stories of former palace maids who were found begging near the very gates they had once been forbidden to leave. They would sit in the dust, their voices thin and cracked, asking for a few coppers from tourists who had come to see the palace museum. They were the living remnants of a world that was being packaged and sold as a tourist attraction. The psychological toll was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Many of these women suffered from a profound sense of dislocation, a feeling that they were no longer truly alive. They would gather in small groups in the parks of Beijing, speaking in the hushed, polite tones of the court, trying to recreate a hierarchy that no longer existed. In these small circles, they were still consorts and ladies in waiting, holding on to their titles like life rafts in a stormy sea. They would share memories of the smell of the plum blossoms in the palace gardens, or the specific way the light hit the yellow tiles at noon. These memories were the only things the Republic could not take from them, and the only things that kept them from despair. But as the years passed, the group grew smaller, and the memories began to fade like old silk. The harsh winters of Beijing claimed the lives of those who could not afford charcoal or warm blankets. One by one, the voices that knew the secrets of the inner court were silenced by the cold reality of the street. The women who had once been the most protected human beings on earth were now the most vulnerable. They were learning that the walls of the Forbidden City had not just been a prison, but a shield against a world that was far more cruel than any emperor. The transition was complete, and the cost was being paid in blood and broken spirits. Yet, even in the depths of their poverty, some maintained a stubborn, quiet pride. They would keep their one remaining silk robe clean and mended, wearing it only on the most special occasions. It was a silent protest against a world that told them they were nothing, a final assertion that they had once belonged to the stars. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the fate of these women became a footnote in the larger, more violent history of China. For the lower-ranking women, the struggle was not about politics or ideology. It was about the next meal. And for some, the desperation would lead them back to the very place they had been expelled from, but in a role they never could have imagined. The pawned jewels and faded silks were only the beginning of the loss. For the most desperate among them, the only way to survive was to sell the one thing they had left, the secrets of the dead. Chapter 9. Poverty and Loss. The fate of the lower-ranking women. The lower-ranking concubines were the first to be swallowed by the silence of the city. While the high-ranking consorts occupied the headlines, these women were the background characters of the Forbidden City, now cast as extras in a play they did not understand. They lacked the political weight to demand mansions and the fame to attract wealthy protectors. Many of these women had entered the palace as children, selected for their beauty or their family lineage. They had spent decades learning how to please an emperor who was now a ghost in a modern world. When the gates finally closed behind them, they were not just losing a home, but an entire identity that had no value in the streets of Beijing. Their refined education became their greatest handicap in the struggle for survival. They were masters of the zither, experts in the placement of incense, and scholars of the subtle art of the fan. But in the wet markets and textile mills of the 1920s, these skills were worth less than the dust on their shoes. One former palace maid, known only by her surname Zhang, was found years later working in a communal laundry. Her hands, which had once been soaked in rosewater and protected by silver nail guards, were now cracked and bleeding from lye. She spoke of the palace not as a place of luxury, but as a dream she had been forced to wake up from. For many, the only way to eat was to sell the only thing they had left, their memories. Sensationalist newspapers and opportunistic historians began to hunt for these women in the slums. They were paid a few coins to reveal the intimate habits of the late emperors or the scandals of the inner court. They told stories of the Empress Dowager's temper and the secret heartbreaks of the young Puyi. Each story sold was a piece of their dignity stripped away, a betrayal of the vows of silence they had taken decades ago. They were trading their last shreds of imperial dignity just to buy a bowl of thin rice porridge. The social stigma was a constant shadow that followed them through the narrow hutongs. To the modern youth of Beijing, they were the emperor's leftovers, symbols of a feudal darkness that China was trying to burn away. They were often mocked for their stilted, formal way of speaking and their refusal to cut their long, traditional hair. Some women tried to return to their ancestral homes, traveling hundreds of miles to rural provinces they barely remembered. They arrived to find their parents long dead and their siblings viewing them as a financial burden. In many cases, they were turned away at the village gates, seen as bad omens from a vanished era. The winter of 1925 was particularly brutal, a season of ice that showed no mercy to the displaced. Without the charcoal braziers of the palace, many of the older women succumbed to pneumonia in unheated rooms. They died alone, wrapped in the thin, frayed remnants of their imperial silks. There were no eunuchs to prepare their bodies, and no elaborate funeral processions to the eastern Qing tombs. Their remains were often buried in unmarked graves, the locations of which were lost within a single generation. The women who had once been the most exclusive members of society vanished without a trace. A few managed to find work as domestic servants for the new elite, the wealthy businessmen and politicians of the Republic. It was a bitter irony to spend their twilight years cleaning the floors of men who had helped destroy their world. They moved through these modern houses like ghosts, silent and invisible. Even in these lowly roles, they maintained a strange, haunting elegance that unsettled their new masters. They would bow with a grace that was too perfect, a remnant of a time when every movement was a ritual. They were living reminders that the past was never truly dead, only hidden in the corners of a room. The psychological weight of their fall often led to a total withdrawal from reality. Some women continued to dress in their tattered palace robes every single day, even as they sat in the mud. They would talk to empty chairs, addressing invisible emperors and high-ranking rivals in a theater of the mind. As the decade progressed, the number of these lower-ranking survivors dwindled rapidly. The Republic, preoccupied with warlord battles and rising foreign tensions, never bothered to track their fates. They were a problem that solved itself through the simple, cruel passage of time. By the late 1930s, the concubines of the slums had become urban legends, figures seen only at the edges of the markets. They were the last witnesses to a 1,000-year-old tradition that had collapsed in a single afternoon. Their silence was the final chapter of a story that the new China was eager to forget. But as the shadows of a new war began to loom over the country, the world would realize it had not seen the last of the imperial line. While the lower-ranking women faded into the dust, one final figure was being prepared for a cold resurrection. The dragon was not dead. It was merely waiting for a new master to give it a throne of ice. The greatest tragedy of the imperial women was about to collide with the rise of a puppet empire. Chapter 10. The Final Echoes of Imperial China. The dream of a restored Qing dynasty found its final cold breath in the frozen plains of Manchuria. As the 1930s dawned, the Japanese Empire sought to use the former Emperor Puyi as a puppet, creating the state of Manchukuo. Puyi's own wives and immediate family members were brought to staff a new, artificial court in Changchun, while the older consorts remained behind. This was not a return to glory, but a pantomime of power, performed under the watchful eyes of foreign generals. The women found themselves once again behind walls, but these were walls made of Japanese steel rather than ancient brick. The rituals were reenacted, the tea was poured, and the titles were spoken, but the soul of the great Qing was missing. When the Soviet Red Army swept into Manchuria in 1945, the puppet court shattered like cheap glass. The women were once again cast into the chaos of a world at war, fleeing the advancing armies as the empire they served evaporated for the final time. Some were captured, some disappeared into the vastness of the countryside, and others returned to a Beijing that was on the verge of a total transformation. The rise of the People's Republic in 1949 brought a final ideological end to the concept of the concubine. Viewed as remnants of a decadent feudal past, these women were stripped of their former status and re-educated to become ordinary citizens. The few who remained were integrated into the new social order, often working in state factories or communal kitchens. By the 1960s and 70s, the women of the Forbidden City had become living fossils in a country that was rapidly industrializing. They lived in modest apartments, their imperial pasts hidden behind curtains of silence and fear during the Cultural Revolution. To speak of the old days was dangerous, and many burned their last remaining silk robes to avoid being targeted as class enemies. As the 20th century drew to a close, the last of the imperial concubines began to pass away, one by one. Their deaths were quiet affairs, noted only by a few family members or curious historians. With each passing, a library of unwritten history, of scents, sounds, and courtly secrets, was buried forever. The fall of the king was not just the end of a government. It was the extinction of a human ecosystem that had existed for 2 millennia. These women were the final blossoms of a garden that had been walled off from the world for too long. Their tragedy was not that the empire fell, but that they were forced to survive in its ruins. The memory of the concubines remains etched in the red walls of the palace, a testament to a world that valued tradition over the individual. They were the silent witnesses to the birth of modern China, paying the price for a transition they never asked for. Their story reminds us that when empires crumble, it is the most vulnerable who are left to carry the weight of the debris. Today, the Forbidden City stands as a museum, its red walls polished, and its yellow tiles gleaming under the sun. Millions of tourists walk the paths where the concubines once paced in their silk slippers, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet. The echoes of the imperial court have finally faded, leaving only the wind to whisper through the empty pavilions. If you found this journey into the lost world of the imperial court moving, please subscribe to join us for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. Your support allows us to continue uncovering the stories of those the world tried to forget. Thank you for walking through the gates of time with us.